Welcome to The Enlightened Overachiever, where we explore what it means to be a person living in a time of extraordinary change and intensity. I call it The Enlightened Overachiever because I'm a reformed overachiever. I work with overachievers, and I believe the human race is an overachiever on a planetary scale. Let's get started. Today, I'm talking with Oliver Burkeman. He's a writer, a thinker. He's written a book called Meditations for Mortals, which is a reference, I think, to Marcus Aurelius. And that's because not only does he bring in psychology, biology, neuroscience, and cultural references of all sorts from Wittgenstein to Aristotle, but he is also deeply influenced by the Stoics, of which Marcus Aurelius was one. And in his writing, you can feel the pulse of that Stoic fascination with mortality and its ruthless, almost Zen Buddhist insistence that we keep waking up to how short our lives are and how little time we have to enjoy this brief life and to make something of it, to be productive. He's not just about sitting under the trees and savoring the bliss of being alive. Oliver Burkeman really is an overachiever, and he has some of that kind of crackling tension and steeliness in him, as you'll see. But he has found his own way to an understanding, to a philosophy of how to be productive in this mad world that is in keeping with those ancient and timeless principles of respect for reality, basically. And that gives him a kind of ruthlessness, a kind of the ruthlessness of a Zen teacher who is trying to give a harsh but liberating message if you will only listen to it. And I'm going to start by just reading a quote from his book, which I loved, which I think sums up his entire philosophy. Here goes. You know that cloud of melancholy that sometimes descends when it seems as though the life you had envisaged yourself might never come to fruition after all. Well, the magic begins when you understand that it definitely won't come to fruition. That says it all. Welcome to my guest, Oliver Burkeman. Let me give you a bit of background. And first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining the Enlightened Overachiever. I'm almost a classic case study for the problem that you address in all of your work. I'm a procrastinator. I get caught in endless loops of planning. I have a whole pile I've actually put them all in one massive Tupperware of notebooks from the last decade, 2 decades, where if you open them up from any given year randomly, there will be bullet points outlining the plan, the strategy. And
I know this well.
Yeah. And I've spent months, years in planning, but not doing. And I'm also impatient, restless, living in the future, all those things. So it's been a long journey to get even interested in the sort of work that you're doing. And now it's had to become much more central to my life because I'm a father. I'm an old dad. I've got 3 small kids, and I'm meeting the forces of physics and mortality and health, and the limits of what you can do with the physical body and mind at a certain age. So yeah, it's extremely timely. The Enlightened Overachiever is addressing people like me, many of whom I work with as I'm a coach. I'm a writer as well and a coach, and I work with people who are from a similar mindset and disposition and background to me. That is, at some point in their life when they were young, they figured out that they could get points and attention or positive affirmation by doing really well, achieving in sports or school, and then just kept doing that same trick again and again and again, and went up into, my background is in consultancy and finance and entrepreneurship and MBA and all that stuff before I fell off the wagon and went down the rabbit hole, to mix the metaphors. But the people I work with are often still very much in that, very successful, but there's no other model, really. So there's no other model except the achieving. This podcast is not intended to be a teachy, coachy platform. It's an inquiry and exploration of what are the emerging ways in which we can think about living differently. And not just on the individual level, but also on the societal level.
Sure.
I like to describe humanity itself as a form of overachiever, because let's face it, we've done quite a lot in the last few thousand years. And in many ways, we are paying the cost of that as well as picking up the benefits. So I personally feel that the work that you're doing, Oliver, synthesizing, retelling, and bridging people into sort of different ways of looking at productivity and life, is not just personal, individually relevant, but it has sort of relevance to the wider world. Right? So what are we collectively doing here? Right? And what can we hope for? Where is this going? So that's why I was very interested to talk. And broadly speaking, in the podcast, I'm interviewing thinkers and entrepreneurs, just to keep it simple. Because for me, thinking and doing, if they can cross over, you're in a good place.
Yes.
Very often, there's either the thinking or the doing, and there's a rare category of person who's done enough doing and thinking, or knows how to think, has learned how to think and do. And I think that's probably the category that you're in as well.
Hope so. Let's see how we go.
Thank you very much for being here. Good. So Oliver Burkeman, welcome. I've been following your work for years, initially with the Guardian column. This column will change your life. And I think that's where you first wrote about the rule of 3 or 4 hours. Is that right?
I mean, honestly, who knows? Yes, it was either there or in my newsletter. It will have been. Yeah.
You've been working this theme for a long time, and the rule of 3 or 4 actually sits on your website still as a sort of main, as a flagship concept. It's being one of the perhaps only rules that life that you recommend be free of too many rules and processes is a helpful guideline. The essence of it is that we can only do a certain amount of productive work every day, and the limit's around 3 or 4, and that goes back hundreds of years, and there's endless evidence that that's the case. Do you follow that rule yourself?
Yeah, I think it's. Well, let me back up and say something. Obviously, I think it's obvious to you and probably to your audience, but like my interest in all of this comes from struggling with it and from being exactly the kind of person who needs to grapple with this stuff. So I think that's just an important kind of framing device. I do think I've figured some things out and have some useful things to say, but it definitely comes from that place of being incredibly prone to sort of procrastination or endless planning paralysis and perfectionism and all the rest of it. The 3 or 4 hour rule, as I have labeled it, because you've got to give things a label, as you say, right, it's this idea that a certain kind of work, I would say sort of knowledge work, I think it probably is possible for people who are in good shape to do certain kinds of physical work for significantly longer than that in a day. But if you're a writer, if you're a thinker, designer, if you're doing kind of the kind of work that involves thinking hard with in concert with other people, all sorts of jobs that so many people have today, there's really good reason to believe that 4 hours of real focused work is about the limit. And yes, I mean, I don't, at the moment, my own personal practices are in constant evolution. And I wouldn't say that at the moment I necessarily sit down at a specific time and work for 4 hours and then stop or anything like that. Happy to talk about what my own personal rhythms are at the moment. But whatever I'm doing, whenever it works, it always turns out in hindsight to have involved about 3 or 4 hours, right? If I can do 3 hours of the main project that really counts, 5 or so days a week, and make sure that I have a bit of more time for the admin stuff, for rest and replenishment, for talking to people and things, that is a way of producing more and better outputs over the long haul by far than any kind of, now I'm going to do it for 10 hours and power through. Just occasionally a deadline has required that of me and I'll do it, of course, but it's no fun and it's not the best. It's not the way to the best work.
Which presupposes that you know what the one project is that moves the thing forward, which I think is one of the chapters in your most recent book, isn't it? About what's your life's work, or in that, what's the life task in that moment, having clarity on that and being able to prioritize that. No easy task, right?
No, and in fact, it's a place where the risk of perfectionism rears its head again, because it's very easy to fall into thinking that you need to pick the best thing to do and to know that what you're doing is the best thing for you to be doing. and a lot of very useful stuff in the world of work and personal development, like, the idea of picking the one thing that makes the biggest difference to everything else can be overinterpreted in that way, right? So it's like, oh no, now I don't know if I'm even doing the most important thing. I think for most of us looking at our work, we would actually, if we were honest with ourselves, be able to pick, 5 or 6 things that we could spend the next 2 or 3 hours on that would clearly matter, and a whole bunch of other things that might be on some level a bit of an avoidance of those things that really matter. So for me, and it's going to be works profession specific, but there is a kind of thing that I just know deep down is like the sort of creative core of what I'm doing. It isn't always writing, it isn't always working on book stuff, but I do know when I'm sort of in that space and doing that thing that is a little bit demanding and I'd like to avoid, but that is so rich for me as an experience. Like, I think people know roughly. Of course, if you're in the kind of like totally the wrong job kind of situation, the considerations are different. You may well know that feeling that I'm talking about and see it nowhere in the work that you're doing, but it's definitely a sort of intuitive navigation.
Let's zoom out for a moment. Just I want to describe for those who don't know your work essentially. So you used to be for a long time, I think, you ran a column at The Guardian after being a features writer there, and you were the psychology guy, right? So you used that column. This column will change your life, to talk about the stuff about psychology and what was going on. Was that a really important learning? I'm getting sucked into digressions all this time. Let me just do the big picture stuff.
Sure.
You wrote this column. This column will change your life. Wrote a very successful book called 4,000 Weeks, which, by the way, I was at football with my kids the other day, last weekend. I mentioned that I was chatting to you, and one of the dads said, "Oh, his book changed my life." And
I'm so happy.
And he then cited the 5 things. He's got a very organized mind. He cited the 5 things he took away, which I recorded on my phone.
Amazing.
Yeah. So clearly, there was a reason why that book did so well. And just to put the listener in the picture, the concept of 4,000 weeks is that you have roughly 4,000 weeks of life, or productive life, or just life, I'm not sure, in which to get things done. Kind of setting out the stall really for what your theme has been and is since then, which is that life, mortality, reality, when you look at it closely and properly, doesn't leave us much wiggle room. We live for a large part in a fantasy of endless time and endless potential, which creates a lot of suffering. And the pathway into productivity, as well as happiness and peace, is to accept those constraints and the finitude of life, if that's the way of pronouncing it, so that we can then accept that it's going to be an absolute mess forever. So let's just get a few things done that we find satisfying. You, at some point, started your regular newsletter, The Imperfectionist, which is a great read, and recently published Meditations for Mortals, which I have here, which I think possibly was a deliberate wink at Marcus Aurelius, but I can't be sure.
Yes. It was.
Yeah.
Various people think it's a book about meditation, and so I'm glad that you've caught the correct reference. Yeah,
there's a risk there, I guess. But this book, how long was it? When did it come out, Oliver? Not long ago, 6 months, a year?
The paperback that you're holding, the UK paperback that you're holding has only been out about a month and a bit, but the book itself, earlier, a bit earlier than that.
So you're in the publicity cycle right now, doing the talks. Yeah, and it's a terrific book, and I've already made the first imperfect, self-accepting kind decision, which is that I'm not going to read one chapter every day for 4 weeks.
Breaking the rules.
I thought I'd get that clear right at the beginning, so that I didn't start to see it as a cross. But the idea is that you read a chapter every day for 4 weeks. And I think that's eminently doable because the chapters are short, extremely engaging and well written. And if I could say, Oliver, I think what I have enjoyed about getting to know your style is that you combine being deeply challenging in a sense and confronting in the way that a Zen master might be, with being very reassuring. So tonally, you're very reassuring. You're like the kind of uncle or the guy next door very British in a way. But there's also a lot of humor and compressed wisdom and learning in it. And I think another thing that I love about your approach and your style is that you've clearly developed the deep craft and discipline of journalism, which means, unlike some other self-help books, if you want to put it that way, you draw very deeply on the wisdom of others. And, your chapters are full of quotations and references. It's very informative and educational in that sense. But you've also developed your own point of view. So your own sort of point, you're starting, it seems, in the last, years to start to become an original thinker as well as a journalist. And I think that really translates in the book, which I've already recommended to my brother, by the way.
I'm very glad to hear all of that. That's brilliant. Yes, no, that on the one level, that's very flattering, but on the other level, I think it speaks to a true account of my evolution of what I've been doing.
Yeah, so perhaps we could go there, because I do always like to find out about the origins of things, the provenance of things, and I'd like to understand a little bit before we get into the substance of the stuff, how you came to be here. I'm interested to know, not so much in a biographical sense as perhaps a psychological sense, how did you come to this? What were the struggles that you overcame in a sense to get here? Had you been a perfectionist yourself, and if so, where did that come from, and how did you find the wherewithal to move beyond it?
Wow, yes, big set of questions. So I'll just sort of take a stab through whatever combination of how I was raised and DNA and the culture. I definitely, by my sort of late teens, early adulthood, was one of these people that gets labeled an insecure, not necessarily an enlightened, but an insecure overachiever, meaning, people who do really well in our school exams and university and everything, but are doing it all in this, on some level, out of anxiety or out of a sense that if we don't do it, something bad would happen, right? So not just the sort of sheer pleasure of accomplishing things, but a kind of deficit model of accomplishing things, which I think could well be the vast majority of people who get great exam results and do interesting jobs, right? So I think that really is me. Secondary school, I was not too stressed because it was so easy to be around the top of the class. At university, I was suddenly massively anxious because I was in a place with all the people who'd been top of the class in their different schools. It's a very common experience, I think. Then I sort of, became incredibly stressed about all this. And yes, definitely perfectionistic and neurotic, but did really well, again, at that level of academic achievement. So this teaches you something bad, right? Which is that that you get results this way. I think not necessarily all bad, because obviously there are upsides too. But one of the things that people like us tend to experience is that there's a lot of societal affirmation for this particular kind of suffering. There are other kinds of ways people make themselves miserable that society tries to step in and intervene. But being driven or doing lots of stuff is not one of them. And I don't mean that I'm not grateful for a lot of the opportunities that have come my way as a result of that mindset. But then I guess what I was very either lucky to do, or maybe I was following a path unconsciously, is that writing, journalism specifically, and now books that I definitely consider to be, as you say, like journalistic in some quite, deep sense that I could wax pretentiously about if required. But writing and journalism have been like both the thing that I wanted to do as my next thing that I was going to be an insecure overachiever about, but then also something that I was able to use as a container for sort of exploring a lot of these ideas quite deeply, maybe writing and talking about themes that I'd have been embarrassed to think about or would have thought made me feel too vulnerable if they weren't under the guise of like, oh, it's for work and I'm writing a sardonic newspaper column about it. So I think in many ways there was something really importantly therapeutic. Since then I've had useful constructive experience of actual therapy as well, but that was a form of therapy. And I think on some level it remains that. So I've sort of ended up, I think that especially the sort of journalistic idea, right? If you come in there are certain traditions where you have to sort of stick to a certain number of sources, or you're in an academic world, so there are certain rules you have to follow. The great thing about the journalistic vein that I kind of found myself in, this is not the right metaphor, is that like anything that's helpful and useful from almost any tradition, you can bring in, and you can read sort of highbrow and lowbrow stuff, and Christian and Buddhist stuff, and scientific and New Age stuff, and just figure out what resonates, what makes the tuning fork sort of sound the right frequency. And yeah, I think that has slowly but surely, it's taken a while, but it does sort of end up, and has ended up, cohering into a worldview, not that's like fixed at all. I'm still discovering lots about it, but that is very different to the mindset of insecure overachievement, and is much better for me, and probably makes me a lot better to get along with, I hope. And I know from the reactions to the books is something that, like, other people who are perhaps 1.5 steps behind me on this journey can really benefit from.
And how would you headline that or summarize that?
I mean, I think of it as sort of, I'm always experimenting with this, but it's something like stepping more fully and wholeheartedly into the experience of being a limited, finite human being. Not only, you very rightly emphasize like the limited amount of time, but that's almost like only the beginning of it, in terms of all the ways that we're limited in our control and our understanding, and much more besides. So it's sort of it's an approach to reality, to sort of acknowledging, letting reality in, that is definitely difficult and in some ways unpleasant, but that I also think is ultimately incredibly sort of grounding and energizing. I think just to finish off this long disquisition, that's the other thing that I feel like I'm probably trying to do for my own purposes. Is find a way of living that combines peace of mind and freedom from anxiety and some kind of tranquility with the energy of meaningful productivity, with getting to build cool stuff. I want to reject the idea that it's only through desperate anxiety that I can get things done, but I also want to reject the idea that the alternative to that is sort of a certain kind of passive approach to sort of being present in the moment that
yes,
really
or a
annoys
withdrawal
me,
from the world, a kind of
right.
monastic withdrawal. And exactly, you've just laid out the sort of the aspiration of the enlightened overachiever, because there is, and I don't know if it's possible or not. I'm sure it's possible for individuals, a few lucky individuals who work at it hard enough. I don't yet know if it's possible for globally or on some societal level, but let's come to that later. I just wanted to ask you then, given the journey you've been on, which does sound like a piece of luck in a sense, that you had this amazing stump or beat in the Guardian, and you were able to explore, and the way you narrate it sounds incremental and gradual, like a frog being boiled, but in a good way. Was there a moment? Was there, if I think about my own journey into the, through the looking glass, if you like, of no longer just being caught up in the hamster wheel of productivity, there have been step change moments of can't cope anymore, or it's all falling apart, or I'm burning out, and what's happening, Has it been like that for you?
I think it probably has to some extent. The pattern for me, I've spoken about this elsewhere, but the pattern for me is always that, and this is another typical thing of people like me perhaps, I'm really good at sort of intellectual epiphanies. I'm very good at sort of seeing, this is what's wrong with the way I'm doing this, and this is what I need to do instead. And then I'm just terrible at, or much, much worse at kind of living in a different way as a consequence of that intellectual epiphany. So, I don't think when I was a ball of severe anxiety around my university work, for example, I don't think that can count as an epiphany, because it's very important to me as a touchstone looking back, but I don't think it was, I don't think I had an insight as a result of it. I've written and spoken at length, so I'm not going to rehash it, but about a moment that I write about in 4,000 Weeks, sitting on a park bench in Brooklyn, where we lived at the time, and just realizing suddenly that none of the tricks I was using to try to get myself through an unprecedented amount of work by the end of that week, like none of it would ever work, that I was never going to get to this place of serenity and freedom through more discipline, more tricks. And yet, on some level, even today, I half think that might happen one day soon, right? It doesn't go away completely for me. And then even I would say just recently, maybe I'm sort of in one at the moment, not a kind of hitting rock bottom experience so much as a kind of one of those kind of second order shifts where you're like, oh, okay, no, there's a level at which so far, thank goodness, it's not that I realize something I've written in a book is totally wrong. It's actually that I realize I hadn't properly understood the truth of it yet. And that's, as long as it carries on in that vein, I'm happy, because what you don't want to do is suddenly realize that everything you've put out into the world is you don't believe in. But so this idea of, I would say the themes in the new book of sort of this life that I call imperfectionism, this idea of really allowing yourself to feel your feelings of vulnerability and uncertainty and lack of control. Like, a pattern that seems to happen with me is I get so far along that path, I put it out into a book, and then I have to go a bit further along the same path to really feel what I was writing about.
In fact, I've observed, I've written 2 books in my career so far. The first one was about optimism. It was called The Optimist, and I went around the world interviewing optimistic people. And I found that it was only after writing that and learning what I learned, which a lot of which was unexpected, and it involved meeting spiritual people and all sorts of things I just hadn't put in the book proposal. But it took years for the penny to drop in terms of what did it actually mean. And similarly, the book I wrote called The Lazy Guru's Guide to Life, which is about, this is a similar kind of adjacent theme to yours, which is about the way to do things, how to be in flow in a more relaxed way. I'm definitely still trying to master it and embody it. So I see these books, like you say, the head is much faster than the rest of the system, which is itself an interesting thing about our society, isn't it? We seem to know everything about how we should be doing things.
Yeah, right. No, it's the doing and the living into it that is the challenge for sure. Yeah.
And how is in your day-to-day, how is the imperfectionist working for you as a strategy? If we're going to broadly call it, or an anti-strategy, how is it working? How close are you getting to that serenity and energy?
It's very difficult to judge because, I'm certainly, just to look at work for a moment, right? I've done a lot of projects that I would never have thought I would manage to complete, and I've done them and they've gone well. So but then of course you just sort of spiral down to the next level of it. So simple example of this, right? Fairly early on in my journalistic career, I had to learn to challenge my sort of control freak tendencies over my writing, because you have to use it's time to write the column. You don't have a good idea, so you have to use a mediocre idea. It's time to submit the column. It isn't how you want it to be, but you've got to submit it anyway, right? So that on that level, that kind of imperfectionism started early. Then you sort of take it forward to the book level, and the same things apply, but the stakes feel higher because books have such cultural cachet. So it's like, wow, I'm not completely happy with any of this, and it's about to go and be turned into a real book. And now, in terms of the stage that my sort of self-employed little business is at, I can see that what I really want and what would work well for me to do some of the things I want to do is in a very small, modest way, to not be doing all of it myself and to sort of build a very small kind of team around me. And now I realize I've got whole layers of control freakery around delegation to other people that is like deeper than any of the other stuff, but I just never had to deal with it until now. So it's this kind of constant, it's that again. But this time, of course, you see it coming. So I think it owes me less than it did. That's just one example of a certain kind of pattern, which is that, I don't think you ever solve everything. I think you hopefully get to it on sort of deeper or richer or more meaningful levels.
Or more applied levels, because as you grow, as you build, you have to take, you encounter more responsibility, more relationships, more interactions where those...
Right, and I would say, I've been talking about work, but I'm pretty sure that I could give a whole identical account of that pattern when it comes to relationship, right? It's like go from like commitment phobe through to being part of a family through to really being part of what it means to be a part. It's like the same process.
Yeah. To come back to the book for a little bit, I just want to draw attention to chapter 1, because I feel that the first chapter, which is called "It's Worse Than You Think," on the liberation of defeat, for me sort of sums up the whole book in a sense, because and I'm sure there's a good reason why you chose that as the first chapter, or you wrote it as the first chapter, because it's the kind of the paradox that's almost comical, really, that lies at the heart of the whole book and of your insight. I think it's the insight that runs through everything in The Imperfectionist, which is if people see how hopeless their situation is, they'll give up, and then they can have everything. And I want to just quote this wonderful passage about when you're completely beyond hope is that's when the magic begins, because the magic begins when you understand all the things you had hoped for definitely won't come to fruition. It's not that they might not, it's just that they definitely won't come to fruition. Right. And the wonderful thing about this book is that it makes you laugh as well. So it's this kind of the ruthlessness of the message, in a sense, which is why I mentioned Zen, right?
Yes, right, right.
And what you're talking about, actually, in a sense, and I'm sure you've come across this in your explorations, mirrors the spiritual journey. Right? So often in meditation, or in whatever kind of meditation or spiritual practice, there is the moment when it's just too much and you give up, and it gets called different things, the dark night of the soul, in Christian mysticism, or some sort of Zen moment of giving up in I don't know, in Eastern traditions. Are you yourself, has this brought you closer to what might get called popularly a spiritual understanding of life, or a religious understanding of life even?
I mean, I feel like yes, for sure, just because so many of those traditions and sources I find sort of deeply illuminating or moving. And I think Zen has been a very specific one. Zen and Taoism, which are in certain ways, as I understand it, pretty close. On the other hand, I kind of don't know what that means. And it feels like, I think maybe I could imagine somebody who thought that what they were doing was writing sort of social science, finding themselves realizing that they were doing something that was spirituality. But one lucky thing about the sort of attitude that I've brought to all of this from the beginning is that I didn't really ever, again, it's the journalistic thing, right? It's like, why would I not quote a spiritual teacher as soon as I would quote a published study? It's not, I'm not beholden to anyone like that. And I think, I think on some level, I think it is. I mean, I've never seen an account of a sort of a definition of spirituality that rules any of this out and sets it aside. Religion's an interesting thing, because I think so much of that is communal and ritual and rhythmic. It's to do with people. It's to do with how people practice life, as opposed to what they believe or even what they're experiencing inside their own minds. And up until pretty recently in my writing, it's still fairly individualistically focused, even if it's that tries to do that in a sort of generous and outward way. It's not, it's a book about how to deal with your overwhelm or your procrastination. It's not a book about written from the perspective of the collective. But yeah, no, and I mean, I think Zen specifically has grown in because it is so eloquent on that giving up. There are other traditions that I think you probably maybe know more about this than I do, but there's traditions of Buddhism that are incredibly valuable, but that are prone to being misused especially by sort of Western acolytes, as like long step-by-step incremental progress from ordinary life to a state of perpetual total enlightenment, and precisely to sort of fuel that notion of like the good stuff is coming later and I'm going to succeed. And there are all sorts of ways in which Zen writing, anyways, is sort of constantly undercutting that.
So there's all
I'm a much better reader of Buddhist literature than I am a meditator, and I think that's where Zen can really come into its own.
Yeah, Zen, you get away with a lot. I mean, in a sense. But it's interesting you're drawing attention to what essentially might even be the roots of the modern overachiever thing, because religion, let's face it, and spirituality did that all first, didn't it? I mean, the whole idea of the chosen and the Puritans, and that there is actually, if you do the right things in the right order and you say the right prayers, or you do the right penances, you can attain nirvana, or you can go to heaven, or whatever it is, or you can avoid hell. Sort of started there.
It's fascinating. In a sense, a slightly confounding factor here is that sort of everything started in religion, because until a few hundred years ago, just sort of like virtually any contemplation of the meaning of life would have happened within a religious context. But yes, definitely the sort of Protestant work ethic, the idea of earning your salvation through output is definitely a thing. So is the alternative, right? The sort of within Christianity, the sort of grace-based approach that says you can't earn it. You're fully loved from the beginning, and there's nothing you can do to change the situation. So all these different traditions in lots of different faiths. I think the other thing that points to that's really interesting is that, like, we do want to be saved on some level, and I think you can see a lot of the kind of productivity, personal development, psychotherapy quest, certainly when it goes wrong or is at its least useful, is when we pursue that as some sort of, secular religion, some idea that if we finally get there, then we will like be okay and be allowed to exist. And sure, if a sort of slightly stereotypical Calvinist was working all day and night because they wanted to demonstrate that they were worthy of God's love, like, what are insecure overachievers doing but working all day and night to demonstrate that they're worthy of some kind of love from society or their parents or whatever it might be?
Which I think brings into focus another unusual thing about your book, or let's say a useful thing about it, which is that you have, and you talk a little, like you talk lightly about why there's no reason why you shouldn't draw on spirituality and so on. When in fact, actually, until very recently, those things have been off the mainstream or have been considered. I think it's only recent that there's high cultural permission to draw on any source.
Right.
But your work combines, because you just talked about something psychological in a sense, so trying to get love. What your book does, and your other writing does, I think, which brings together psychology, spirituality, and also what you might call the creative disciplines. It brings together all those worlds, and they all agree in some sense on the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I'm going to maybe only be responding tangentially, but this really reminds me that one of the big moments in my writing journey, I guess, was when I realized that there was this thing called ideas journalism. Slightly pretentious title, but I embraced it. Until at least fairly recently, I don't know if it still exists, the Boston Globe had a features section that was called Ideas, and it was the Ideas section. And there was a magazine that I don't know if you've ever stumbled across. It only ran for a small amount of time, called Lingua Franca, which was, on some level, I feel like, I think the people who had influenced, and I was one of them, were deeply influenced by it. It was a journal, or it was an attempt to take the world of academia and present it in a way that reported on ideas in a deeply human way. So it's about the feuds within university departments over ideas. It's not about the dry ideas themselves. It's about sort of, strange personalities existing within the world. And I was just like, that just sort of completely energized me, and still does, as a journalist and as a reader. So the reason that I think this is at all relevant to what you were saying is, like, that's the perspective from which I come at this, and kind of don't understand why you would want to restrict yourself to only things you could back up with studies, or only one religious tradition or something like that. Because somebody I was talking to the other day made the extremely insightful claim about me. I thought that maybe journalism was my spiritual practice. And I think there's something really interesting about that, like the ability to hold yourself open like that requires some kind of container or framework. You can't just do it. Like, and if it's like, oh, that's because it's journalism, then that's really helpful as a way of going forwards.
Yeah, and a parallel to that would be the creative arts, I guess, where you see.
Right.
And have you read Daily Rituals, by the way?
I have. Mason Curry. Yeah,
it's one of my favorite books, Daily Rituals. I cite it very often because, well, apart from the fact that the 3 to 4 hour rule is very apparent in it, you see that across different. It's a compendium of different artists and creatives and scientists and innovators, daily rituals and daily practices, and you see that, in a sense, it is a kind of what you might call a spiritual path. The creativity requires this kind of letting go on a very profound level. And anyone who's tried to create anything knows that, you go through this incredible roller coaster where there's inspiration and excitement, and then there's deep demoralization and giving up, and then there's breakthroughs and so on. And then the creative, if you're a journalist or some other kind of artist or creative, it becomes the weave of your day-to-day life in a way that actually some of my listeners won't be able to imagine, because they might be CEOs or very busy managers, and a lot of what they're doing is execution and task and relationship and meetings, but they don't have a creative practice. I suppose there's a couple of branching off questions from this. I suppose the question that immediately comes to mind is, what about the people who don't have the privilege or the luxury of a creative career in order to explore imperfectionism?
Well, firstly, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I'm sure that, interpersonal relationships is a creative domain, perhaps the creative domain, perhaps one that people like me have gravitated away from into writing because it's more challenging than sitting at a laptop thinking big thoughts. And certainly, like, relationships are where I find the most sort of creative edge, and like that's where I'm developing, if I'm developing at all, in my life. So I want to say, first of all, that it's at least possible. It will depend on your setting, of course, and your professional setting, organizational setting, that leadership and management can be a creative practice in a genuine, meaningful way. I'm not even sure what we mean when we're talking about creativity, but I think that the thing that you put your finger on that seemed very well put is that it's sort of anything that involves a kind of a surrender, a learning to let go of the total reliance on the intellect and the conscious will to sort of work with something else, which in the case of writing is, it's working with other sources, but it's also working with your unconscious, right? It's like learning to listen for where things should go next, and finding that actually that seems to result in lots of good results, as opposed to just really sort of trying to make things completely predictable and formulaic. It's crucial to the process. And so I think you can imagine, firstly, that that's an attitude that could be taken to, management and leadership roles. Secondly, that if you want to add this as a facet to your life, as a hobby or as a spare time thing, that's the way to navigate it, right? It's not like, oh, well, I should do writing if writing isn't what makes you feel alive, but that there will be something, perhaps something you really enjoyed in your childhood. It's always a good clue. I think it can probably be physical things of certain kinds. I feel like the rock climbers I know are creative in the climbing. Something that you've got some hunch that you can get some pretty good results out of, but that it is necessary in order to get those results that there is a trusting to something beyond the conscious mind and the intellect.
Yeah.
So
Nice. Yeah, and back to the non-artistic creative elements of work, and no doubt at all, and know that that working in complex systems and organizations, as any kind of, if you're in any kind of position of influence or authority, or even in a very small, in a family unit, or in any small team, creativity is essential to problem solving. And so how do I deal with this situation or this person or this conflict? What's harder is to have the to have the disciplines of, we'll come back to practices. Maybe that'd be my other question coming off this, which is that there are certain practices that fortify this kind of, build this muscle of imperfectionism in a way. And in the corporate domain, of course, it's very, very metrics, very target driven, and everything's measured and OKRs and KPIs. In that environment, I think it requires a bit more courage and innovation to practice some of this, this letting go stuff. Definitely possible, but if there's anything you want to say in that domain, I appreciate you're not a corporate or organizational expert, but if there's anything with regards to how to orient towards fixed milestones or goals, or you have to meet shareholder expectations. Yeah, and how would you advise on that?
I mean, a couple of thoughts spring to mind, and it has come up here and there in conversation in the past. I mean, firstly, I think that by doing the sort of inner work that we're talking about here, and that I hope that my books are an aid to, you can, I think, get more literate with your own emotions and your own psychology, such that you're a little bit more aware when you're doing something, not because it's in tune with the highest goals you have for your work and for your organization, but in order to foster some feeling of being in control, or to make a feeling of insecurity go away. And I have definitely encountered large organizations and been parts of bits of large organizations once or twice where it's pretty clear that some procedure or process exists to try to make a senior manager feel like to deal with some emotional issue that they have about wanting to feel in control of the process, rather than because it's a good indicator of the forward progress of the organization. So I think, I don't want to separate off that sort of internal emotional literacy from the organizational job. The other thing that I've had good reactions to when I've sort of talked about it and proposed it here and there is, like, you can do creative practices about the challenges of organizational life, right? So you can find yourself with some awkward interpersonal issue to resolve, or some complicated clash of corporate cultures, or whatever it is you're dealing with. And you can open up a text file on your laptop, and you can set a timer for 20 minutes, and you can do free writing. In other words, you can, which I define as, in this case, as, write anything, don't stop, don't wait to have good ideas about the topic before you put them down, but just keep your fingers moving. You don't need to write fast. It's just a question of moving rather than not moving. If you can't think of anything to write that you can't think of anything to write, and see what happens. Like, as a way of opening up the flow of things of answers you may already know, but hadn't brought into conscious awareness. Like, and the worst case scenario here is, like, you sat at your computer for 20 minutes and, it goes without saying, this is writing that no one else is ever going to see. But just that kind of practice, which I associate with the kind of thing I do, there is no reason in the world why that can't be relevant.
Yeah,
to
and that's
other kinds of things that other people do.
I suppose that's that's in the realm of creativity techniques and creative techniques that can assist you in doing what you need to do and thinking divergently before converging and so on. One thing that's coming to mind, I mean, I really want to ask what your daily practices are. So, but maybe we can just come back to that, because I want to know what your daily practices are. In a sense, what your daily rituals are. But I do want to sort of look at the bigger picture, the global picture, in a way, when you talk about all this, essentially, modern, as you call it, late stage capitalism, a couple of times in your book, and just where we're at, whatever at is right now, is very, very good at co-opting ideas and then integrating them into being more useful and productive. And you've lived in the US, you've lived in Europe, in the UK. You've seen the differences culturally, and you know the power, I'm sure, of that productivity mindset. My question for you would be, do you think it's possible that the work that you're doing and that others are doing in the same vein can affect or help to support a shift that is bigger than just a few lucky people who have the time and the privilege to do this? And if so, have you started to sketch in your mind a vision of what the world could look like if everyone was being imperfectionist?
I mean, it's a huge question, and I think about it a lot. I think anyone who writes in the vein of self-help, however, counterintuitively or subversively you're trying to do it, is still writing with taking on board that basic notion that it's on the individual person to make their lives work better than they're currently working, and you can do it alone. And I don't agree with any of that, but you have to sort of work on that assumption in order to say anything useful in a book focused at individuals. That said, I do think that all of this stuff that we're talking about, and certainly this worldview of embracing limitation and turning towards it, it's either true for all of us or it isn't true at all on some level. It may well be that some of us are in privileged positions where we can experiment with it, and it's easier to confront for us than for other people, etc., etc. But that basic idea that we are all finite, that we all have to make choices about what we do with our time, that we all rely on other people to do anything meaningful with our time, that we're all facing the future in a situation of having no ability to know what it holds. All of that is sort of universal. So right there at the beginning, there's a potential for some kind of solidarity, right? Because this is something that unites the luckiest and the least lucky. Then, of course, this theme of limitation is very clearly brought to life, I guess, most obviously in a climate crisis, but also to some extent by all the debate and panic around artificial intelligence, and possibly the other kind of the political crises as well. So all these different crises roiling the planet. And I think in all of those, that question of what it is to live within and really step into our limitations is incredibly central to that. So I am absolutely sure that the sort of deep ethos of this way of looking at the world is one that operates at the level of the collective society, the planet, all of it. And I could probably be drawn out on specific aspects of that if you have a specific question, but I don't know. I don't have a sort of well worked out worldview of what that looks like.
Well, let's go back to Marcus Aurelius for a minute. So sorry to talk over you, but Stoicism, and I mean, it shouldn't just go on about spirituality, but philosophy is obviously a big thing as well. There's you quote also Heidegger and the Stoics and others as well. Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics were writing, Marcus Aurelius in particular, I think, at a time when pretty soon after Rome was going to go into terminal decline. And so having a good attitude towards life, which, whether that's what Stoicism is, having an attitude of imperfectionism and transience and humility and the foundations that are necessary for a creative and productive life, I guess, and a happy life. It isn't necessarily a recipe for survival in the world or for a thriving society. I guess my question here that I'm reaching after is there hope in your mind that collectively we might aspire to a bigger picture shift towards something that looks a bit like this? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's on the cards? What do you think it requires other than billions of individual choices?
It's interesting because, of course, that is what it will be, right? If it were to happen on some level, you could see it as it's always going to be billions of individual choices, even if it is individual choices that are choices to be part of movements that do things that then sort of wreak change at a different level. But I don't know. I don't know how to answer this question. And the thing that is coming to my mind as possibly useful is to sort of zoom out, as you mentioned, the Stoics and ancient philosophy, sort of zoom out onto a sort of temporal horizon of looking at this through over the centuries and over millennia, and to sort of, I think one good reason for hope is everything that's gone before in humanity, right? Like that at the same time as sort of all the horrors and suffering and disasters and exploitation and terribleness of human history, like none of this that we're talking about has ever been extinguished. None of this ever stops. But I don't know. I'm not answering your question well. I do think the more I think about this broad theme of sort of unclenching into this human reality and being here and showing up, and all the rest of the stuff we've been talking about to some extent, the more it really becomes clear that it is not just something you have to do with other people, but it is inherently relationally constituted, right? That great line, that great phrase, I think that Thich Nhat Hanh has, that we inter-are as humans and as entities on the planet. So at a certain point, it's not about sort of feel-good ideas about making life kinder or more compassionate. It's just about like taking a hard-headed approach to what reality really is. And if I'm going to do that with respect to our limitations, at some point you have to accept that means that everything that we're talking about here is about interconnection and interdependence entirely.
What's an example? What would be an example of that?
Well, I mean, it's a cliche, right? But just the sense in which literally everything we do in the course of a creative life or any life is, thousands upon thousands of other people are implicated in it all the time, whether it's the old cliche of like, thinking about all the people who contributed in some sense to the plate of food that I'm eating from at dinner, or if it's the fact that, the writing that I'm doing only exists as an expression of millennia of other people's thoughts and only has value in the sense that it reaches other people in some way that it hadn't before, and that people are moved by that. Like, all I'm trying to express here is that, like, this truism that, like, can't do it all alone and no man is an island and all the rest of it. We know that almost from birth, but the degree to which it's absolutely constitutive of everything we're talking about here is interesting to me. And obviously you can then pull in kind of Eastern philosophy ideas about dependent origination and what self really is and all that stuff. And we could talk for another 3 hours about that probably, but you get the picture.
Coming back to the individual. So I think there's a struggle, which I often see in people I work with as well, in clients and coachees and in friends and in myself, which is there's a kind of tussle that appears to be endless between the manager and the managed in ourselves. So we've split into one who's managing and one who secretly believes they're lazy, right? So there's a sort of, what's implicit in that split is that I have to push myself, right? And again, I see this fractally, right? Because you see it in organizations, you see it in teams. It happens in my family, right? I have to push my kids to go upstairs to bed. I have to push them to do their homework. I have to push them to tidy up. I have to push myself to work when I don't feel like it, right? And then on the other side, underlying that, a belief that if I don't push myself, I know nothing's going to happen because I'm fundamentally useless or lazy, right? So I'm sure you're well aware of this. And I think the question here is it possible? Two questions. One is, for the overachiever, in a sense, do you have to be enlightened in order to get this right? Or is there a middle ground? Do I have to give up on achieving in order to start to master that? Or is there a kind of, an easier way or a middle path?
I very much hope you don't have to give up on achieving to master that, because I think that's really, that's right where I am situated in terms of what I'm trying to explore. It also seems to me, at least at first glance, that it's obvious that you don't have to give that up, right? Everyone knows people, and I think we know experiences in our own lives where we are doing things that matter and that make a difference, not in order to plug a gap and to feel like we are watching the lazy parts of us like a hawk and keeping ourselves on our toes, but just as an expression of the fact that we enjoy doing the things that we're doing. I think most people probably, even within their work, maybe not most people, maybe that's a glib, but like lots and lots of people, even if they don't love the job they're doing, there will be some aspect of it that sort of comes naturally, and comes naturally is just a way, I think, maybe of expressing that feeling of doing it as an expression of life being good, rather than as a necessity in order to make sure that life doesn't become terribly bad. I've become interested recently. You may know much more about this than me, but in there's various different approaches to psychology that ask us to consider that we contain significant numbers of sub-personalities, right? Internal family systems therapy is the famous one that everyone is very, very excited by. I personally have been more drawn to this tradition of called focusing, but I don't. You're right.
Yes, yeah.
And there's lots of
focusing where you focus in on a.
I mean, I'm no expert. Oh my goodness, I'm the opposite of an expert here. But it's just it's an approach that sort of invites you to find what they call in that tradition a felt sense, something inside you that you then describe in a specific way, and that you sort of identify, like, the something inside me that always wants approval, or the something inside me that is furious about always having to seek people's approval, or whatever it is. And I'm just really, as I say, giving a superficial introduction to this because that's as far as I've got. But this is an approach, and you can see this in Jungian archetypes, and maybe going even further back, maybe it's there in some Eastern religions, but like this basic idea that we contain these kind of contradictory or in elements, tension with each other in some way. And not that these need to be changed or got rid of or anything, but just that in order to see that at all, in order to have that relationship to your internal parts at all, by definition, you then have to be occupying some larger space, right? You have to be being something that can contain all this. And it's the reason I brought this up in response to what you said was that there's something about occupying that place, that kind of situation of presence, or the self with a capital S, I think it gets called in IFS. It's all the same stuff, basically, with like so many different words around it. When you're occupying that sort of seat where you're sort of able to encompass all these kind of contradictory parts of yourself and not be trying to expunge them or not identifying with one of them against the others or anything like that, that seems to me to be the place from which, like, achievement and action happens. There isn't action to plug a hole or fill a deficit, or to not be or to stop something absolutely terrible from happening. It's not an inactive position at all. And actually, I don't think that image, that stereotype of the spiritual master who has transcended everything and just sits there doing nothing is actually, I don't think that's true of the real ones who've done it, you know. And if you've almost any of these greatest spiritual teachers that any of us have heard of have by definition been doing an awful lot of stuff for us to have heard of them, right? Going around teaching, writing books, producing content for Instagram.
Even Chongyam.
Well, even yeah.
Even Chonch, who crashed into
he had lots of problems, but he also had lots of insights. And no, absolutely. And it's a cliche that sort of very, very highly realized Zen people sort of, that you maybe go through a phase of seeming like spaced out and passive, but then you end up being even more the person that you were at the beginning. So yeah. I think that
How close?
I think there is.
Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm strongly hopeful, and I occasionally, and maybe more frequently than I previously feel myself, that there is absolutely a place from which, as it were, we can act in the world and do cool things and make a difference to people's lives and make money, right? It's worldly things as well. It doesn't only have to be making other people's lives better. All of that without it being, just to sort of stave off disaster, just to feel minimally okay about ourselves, just to feel like we haven't completely screwed up the day.
Among the many practices that you've gathered, explored, and researched, is there one or two or three have stuck for you daily-ish? That you more or less stick to? That support?
Yeah, by far, it is morning pages, right? So by far, it is writing 3 sides a narrow ruled fancy notebook. These rules do not need to be followed, but takes me about 40 minutes. I'm not absolutely consistent. Parenting will do that to your consistency, but it's one of those habits, in some sense the only habit that I keep coming back to and don't find hard to keep, precisely because its benefits are so obvious to me, right? I'm not saying like I will do this every day, and I would caution anyone hearing this to assume that that's going to be the practice for them, right? Like maybe it will, and I'd love you to experiment with it if you're listening to this and don't do it, but the reason that practice helps me is because I have found over years of experimentation that that's the one I want to go back to, and that is very helpful just because it opens some sort of channel.
And those who don't know, that's Julia Cameron's three.
Although I suspect now, I mean, I have read that several times. I suspect that what I do now would not bear all that much. It's all evolved. It's basically just free writing for 3 pages. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 rules of hers that I'm probably not following, but it just opens something up. It causes some muscle. I was going to say it causes some muscle to relax so that something can flow, and then it starts to sound very sort of urological. This metaphor that I'm using, but it's something like that, right? It's something like just sort of getting out of my own way so that something can come through me.
What time of day, ideally, or on a good day? What
early? I'm getting up early, partly in an effort to be doing it before the rest of the house wakes up. So it varies. The earliest it would be something like 5:30, but that's not every day. 1.
How many kids do you have?
He is 8.
1. Okay. Yeah, so you're still in the
yeah, but it's certainly different even now, right, than a couple of years ago. We have these kind of lovely encounters in the morning where he gets up and we have a hug and he goes to read a bit or listen to an audiobook or something, or watch TV. I'm not going to claim that we're just in a purely high culture household here. And then I can finish my morning pages and we're both doing our stuff, and it's kind of nice, and then we come together again. There was definitely a time there where one of the things I had to learn was, okay, you're right in the middle of some really interesting and meaningful flow of prose, and it's like, absolutely not. There is a completely superior demand on your attention, which was probably very edifying and useful and salutary to go through.
Thank you. Well, I feel like we've done a good interview. But is there anything that, I mean, I had a couple of questions about what's next. I think, what's next for you? I guess. What do you see coming? What's coming down the line? What's the next level of this? And anything else you'd like to say before finishing? Perhaps there's something about your book.
No, I mean, there's lots of chapter themes we haven't discussed, but that's great. It would be ridiculous to try to cover all of them. I think you've really focused on some that are very sort of dear to my heart. What? Yeah.
Can I just say though, before we go, I do love kayak versus super yacht.
Thank you. Yes, that's a pair of images that I think is really helpful. I'm not going to go into them. It's like, if you're intrigued, go buy the book. Yes.
No,
but
buy the book.
Yes. So I'm working on another book. It's still coming into focus. It would certainly pick up on some of the, I'm sure that once it's finished, someone reads it and they'll be able to see like connections between what we've been talking about here and where that's headed. I've spoken briefly about the sort of challenges of trying to build just a very sort of modestly sized team in doing what I'm doing, instead of being a total solitary control freak. I think that the sort of the question of where that challenge of like unclenching goes next, both in terms of work and in terms of my personal relationship life, and how that connects to the sort of collective societal. Like, it seems to me now, basically, in a way that wasn't true 3 or 4 years ago, that one couldn't write a book about any of this stuff and just sort of pretend that everything happening in the news or is like something separate. I haven't always done that. I've often let that in a little bit, but like, there's some sense in which we're sort of living through history now with a capital H, and we have to be honest with ourselves about it. Well, meaning that, like, I think if you're going to write about this stuff, this broad area that we've been discussing, it's decreasingly possible to just sort of say, well, tune all that out and focus on building your business, or whatever it was people were saying 10 years ago, right? It's like, no, we're all part of this. And actually, not only do we have to endure it, but something about facing it is the path forward, is the way forward. Yeah. So and to the extent that you've touched on that in this conversation, I think you're on the money there. Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like you really you really get the crossover zone that we're talking about. I really appreciate that. It's been really terrific. Thank you, Oliver Burkeman's book, Meditations for Mortals, and I'll plug it in the show notes and so on.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Just one thing I wanted to ask was, how do you do your inbox? Because I'm struggling with it at the moment. Honestly, I'm reaching the highest levels of imperfectionism.
The fact is, I really struggle with this still. And in a way, it's a sort of spiral effect, like I've mentioned, right? It's like you put out a book. One of the things it talks about is having a saner approach to email, and then it does quite well. So you get more email than you did before. It's like I'm a victim of my own ironic processes. I think and I have occasionally, including quite recently, sort of done large declarations of email bankruptcy and just said, you know what? This inbox has 40 emails in it now because I deleted all the ones lower down the list than 40. But this is not optimal. I think the thing that I find firstly, I do use this app that called Superhuman, which I don't love the name of because it feels like it's off message for me. But it's a very intuitive and sort of low stress, serene environment for doing Gmail. Basically, it's and it optimizes the use of like keystrokes and stuff to do simple things. So I do benefit from that. And then it's really, to me, it's really just about getting into the swing of consistently dedicating a certain amount of time per day to this task and being willing to step away at the end of that time if the things are not all done. I'll write more about this one day soon because I think that people it's an ongoing thing. Yeah.
I still think I still think almost every week about an article you wrote about this technique for managing papers of just letting the things on the top, letting things pile up and then only dealing with the ones that are closest to the top.
I find again and again, I am unaware. Maybe there are some people out there who hate my guts because I failed to respond to something, but I find again and again that there's a little bit of self-importance in the notion that if I occasionally miss a few emails for a day or two or a week or two, that I'm somehow ruining everyone else's lives. It's like, no, I'm not so important to their lives. All right. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Oliver. Bye. I really hope you enjoyed this interview with Oliver as much as I did. It's hard not to like him, isn't it? What I enjoyed about this interview is how clearly Oliver and I share the same aspiration, which is to somehow be able to achieve stuff while also being at peace and finding a way to be in harmony with what we really want, I guess, which is not working more than 3 or 4 hours a day. In one way of looking at this conversation, one way of looking at the work he's doing is that it's basically a Trojan horse for spirituality, for spiritual work, inner work, which is about becoming more and more disidentified with the ideas that drove you in your socialized, conditioned self and becoming more and more at home with the reality of your imperfection and therefore accepting that and therefore being at peace and therefore actually joyously embracing life in a way that is allows for peace. But the bit that he's added, and it's a very 21st century, and it's the bit that I've got in my chip as well, which is, and I want to achieve, and I want to do cool stuff. I want to be able to live and succeed in this world that we've constructed, which is kind of weird and not well designed for being at peace. It's not designed in any respect for being at peace or for being in harmony with our hunter-gatherer DNA. But still, I want to make it work. And so I think the open question for me here is still, can it work? Can you do it? And I like that Oliver admits to being a work in progress and still struggling, fighting the fight. That in itself is resonant of the spiritual path, isn't it? Because in the spiritual path, one is always becoming, one is always getting closer to God or to one's soul or to non-existence, whatever it is. But at the same time, is it possible? Is it possible to do this? For centuries, if you were a spiritual practitioner, would have been considered very clearly. You can't worship God and Mammon. You can't have more than one master. Your master is God, or becoming in the inner sense, or you're of the world. And we are at a fascinating time in history and culture where actually it seems possible to do both. But is it just narcissism? Is it just we want everything? We want our cake and eat it? And so that's an open question. Let's find out. Can we move dramatically closer to being in harmony while also remaining fulfilled and successful? I bet you can, but I'm not sure whether I can or if everyone can. There are people who can do it, and then there is the rest of humanity striving and sweating under the load that they've been given to carry in this rather difficult, extraordinary, and apparently quite badly made world. But let's see. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again on the Enlightened Overachiever. Bye for now.